Members of Congress, I now have the high privilege and distinct honor of presenting to you His Excellency Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel.
Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, Senator Ben Cardin, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Senators, members of Congress, distinguished guests. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for giving me the profound honor of addressing this great citadel of democracy for the fourth time. We meet today at a crossroads of history. Our world is in upheaval. In the Middle East, Iran's axis of terror confronts America, Israel, and our Arab friends. This is not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash between barbarism and civilization. It's a clash between those who glorify death and those who sanctify life. For the forces of civilization to triumph, America and Israel must stand together. Because when we stand together, something very simple happens. We win, they lose. And my friends, I came to assure you today of one thing: we will win. Ladies and gentlemen, like December 7th, 1941, and September 11th, 2001, October 7th is a day that will forever live in infamy. It was the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah. It began as a perfect day, not a cloud in the sky. Thousands of young Israelis were celebrating at an outdoor music festival. And suddenly, at 6:29 a.m., as children were still sleeping soundly in their beds in the towns and kibbutzim next to Gaza, suddenly heaven turned into hell. 3,000 Hamas terrorists stormed into Israel. They butchered 1,200 people from 41 countries, including 39 Americans. Proportionately, compared to our population size, that's like 20 9/11s in one day. And these monsters, they raped women, they beheaded men, they burnt babies alive, they killed parents in front of their children, and children in front of their parents. They dragged 255 people, both living and dead, into the dark dungeons of Gaza. Israel has already brought home 135 of these hostages, including 7 who were freed in daring rescue operations. One of those freed hostages, Noor Gamani, is here in the gallery, sitting near my wife Sarah. On the morning of October 7th, the entire world saw Noah's look of desperation as she was violently abducted to Gaza on the back of a motorcycle. I met Noah's mother, Leora, a few months ago. She was dying of cancer. She said to me, "Prime Minister, I have one final wish. I wish to hug my daughter Noah one last time before I die." 2 months ago, I authorized a breathtaking commando rescue operation. Our special forces, including a heroic officer named Arnon Zmora, who fell in this battle, rescued Noah and 3 other hostages. Noah, I think it's one of the most moving things. When Noah was reunited with her mother, Leora, and her mother's last wish came true. Noah, we're so thrilled to have you with us today. Thank you. Many hostage families are also here with us today, including Eliyahu Bibas. Eliyahu Bibas is the grandfather of those 2 beautiful red-headed boys, the Bibas boys, toddlers. And they were taken hostage with their mother and and Eliyahu's son. The entire family was taken hostage. 2 beautiful red-haired children taken hostage. What monsters. And with us also is Iris Chaim, whose son Yotam bravely escaped Hamas captivity with 2 other Israelis, and tragically they were killed making their way back to our lines. We have with us also the families of American hostages. They're here. The pain these families have endured is beyond words. I met with them again yesterday, and I promised them this: I will not rest until all their loved ones are home, all of them. As we speak, we're actively engaged in intensive efforts to secure their release, and I'm confident that these efforts can succeed. Some of them are taking place right now. I want to thank President Biden for his tireless efforts on behalf of the hostages and for his efforts to the hostage families as well. I thank President Biden for his heartfelt support for Israel after the savage attack on October 7th. He rightly called Hamas sheer evil. He dispatched 2 aircraft carriers to the Middle East to deter a wider war. And he came to Israel to stand with us during our darkest hour, a visit that will never be forgotten. President Biden and I have known each other for over 40 years. I want to thank him for half a century of friendship to Israel and for being, as he says, a proud Zionist. Actually, he says, a proud Irish-American Zionist. My friends, for more than 9 months, Israel's soldiers have shown boundless courage. With us today, is Lieutenant Avichai Reuven. Avichai is an officer in the Israeli paratroopers. His family immigrated to Israel from Ethiopia. In the early hours of October 7th, Avichai heard the news of Hamas's bloody rampage. He put on his uniform, grabbed his rifle, but he didn't have a car. So he ran 8 miles to the front lines of Gaza to defend his people. You heard that right. He ran 8 miles, came to the front lines, killed many terrorists, and saved many, many lives. Avichai, we all honor your remarkable heroism. Another Israeli is with us here today, and he's stand up right next to Avichai. This is Master Sergeant Ashraf al-Bakhiri. Ashraf is a Bedouin soldier from the Israeli Muslim community of Raat. On October 7th, Ashraf too killed many terrorists. First, he defended his comrades in the military base, and he then rushed to defend the neighboring communities, including the devastated community of Kibbutz Be'eri. Like Ashraf, the Muslim soldiers of the IDF fought alongside their Jewish, Druze, Christian, and other comrades in arms with tremendous bravery. A third hero, Lieutenant Asa Sofer, is also here with us. Asa fought as an officer in the Tank Corps, and he was wounded in battle. He was wounded in battle while protecting his fellow soldiers from a grenade. He lost his right arm, and the vision in his left eye. He's recovering, and incredibly, within a short time, Asa will soon return to active duty as a commander of a tank company. I just learned there is a fourth hero here, Lieutenant Jonathan Ben Chamo, who lost a leg in Gaza and continued to fight. My friends, these are the soldiers of Israel, unbowed, undaunted, unafraid. As the Bible says, Am kelavi yakum. They shall rise like lions. They have risen like lions. The lions of Judah, the lions of Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, the men and women of the IDF come from every corner of Israeli society. Every ethnicity, every color, every creed, left and right, religious and secular. All are imbued with the indomitable spirit of the Maccabees, the legendary Jewish warriors of antiquity. With us today is Yechiel Leiter, the father of one of those Maccabees. Yechiel's father escaped the Holocaust and found refuge in America. As a young man, Yechiel moved to Israel and raised a family of 8 children. He named his eldest son, Moshe, after his late father. Moshe became an exemplary officer in one of our elite commando units. He served with distinction for 2 decades while raising 6 beautiful children of his own. On October 7th, Moshe volunteered to return to combat. 4 weeks later, he was killed when a booby-trapped mine exploded in a tunnel shaft right next to a mosque. At his son's funeral, Yechiel said this: "If the state of Israel had not been established after the Holocaust, the image engraved in our collective memory would have been the photograph of that helpless Jewish boy in the Warsaw Ghetto holding his hands up in the air with Nazi rifles pointed at him. But because of the birth of Israel," Yechiel continued, "because of the courage of soldiers like my son Moshe, the Jewish people are no longer helpless in the face of our enemies." Yechiel, please rise so we can honor your son's sacrifice. And I pledge to you and to all the bereaved families of Israel, some of whom are in this hall today, the sacrifice of your loved ones will not be in vain. It will not be in vain, because for Israel, never again must never be an empty promise. It must always remain a sacred vow. And after October 7th, never again is now. My friends, defeating our brutal enemies requires both courage and clarity. Clarity begins by knowing the difference between good and evil. Yet incredibly, many anti-Israel protesters, many choose to stand with evil. They stand with Hamas. They stand with rapists and murderers. They stand with people who came into the kibbutzim, into a home. The parents hid the children, the two babies, in the attic, in a secret attic. They murdered the families, the parents. They found the secret latch to the hidden attic, and then they murder the babies. These protesters stand with them. They should be ashamed of themselves. They refuse to make the simple distinction between those who target terrorists and those who target civilians, between the democratic state of Israel and the terrorist thugs of Hamas. We recently learned from the National Security Director, U.S. Director of National Intelligence, that Iran is funding and promoting anti-Israel protests in America. They want to disrupt America. So these protesters burn American flags even on the 4th of July. And I wish to salute the fraternity brothers at the University of North Carolina who protected the American flag against these anti-Israel protesters. For all we know, Iran is funding the anti-Israel protests that are going on right now outside this building. Not that many, but they're there, and throughout the city. Well, I have a message for these protesters. When the tyrants of Tehran, who hang gays from cranes and murder women for not covering their hair, are praising, promoting, and funding you, you have officially become Iran's useful idiots. Some of these protesters, it's amazing, absolutely amazing. Some of these protesters hold up signs proclaiming gays for Gaza. They might as well hold up signs saying chickens for KFC. These protesters chant from the river to the sea, but many don't have a clue what river and what sea they're talking about. They not only get an F in geography, they get an F in history. They call Israel a colonialist state. Don't they know that the land of Israel is where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob prayed, where Isaiah and Jeremiah preached, and where David and Solomon ruled? For nearly 4,000 years, the land of Israel has been the homeland of the Jewish people. It's always been our home. It will always be our home. It's not only the campus protesters who get it wrong. It's also the people who run those campuses. 80 years after the Holocaust, the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and I'm ashamed to say my alma mater, MIT, couldn't bring themselves to condemn the calls for the genocide of Jews. You remember what they said? They said, it depends on the context. Well, let me give these befuddled academics a little context. Anti-Semitism is the world's oldest hatred. For centuries, the massacre of Jews was always preceded by wild accusations. We were accused of everything from poisoning wells, to spreading plagues, to using the blood of slaughtered children to bake Passover matzahs. These preposterous anti-Semitic lies led to persecution, mass murder, and ultimately to history's worst genocide, the Holocaust. Now, just as malicious lies were leveled for centuries at the Jewish people, malicious lies are now being leveled at the Jewish state. No, don't applaud. Listen. The outrageous slanders that paint Israel as racist and genocidal are meant to delegitimize Israel, to demonize the Jewish state, and to demonize Jews everywhere. And no wonder we've witnessed an appalling rise of anti-Semitism in America and around the world. My friends, whenever and wherever we see the scourge of anti-Semitism, we must unequivocally condemn it and resolutely fight it, without exception. And don't be fooled when the blood libels against the Jewish state come from people who wear fancy silk robes and speak in lofty tones about law and justice. Here's a case in point. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has shamefully accused Israel of deliberately starving the people of Gaza. This is utter, complete nonsense. It's a complete fabrication. Israel has enabled more than 40,000 aid trucks to enter Gaza. That's 500,000 tons of food, and that's more than 3,000 calories for every man, woman, and child in Gaza. If there are Palestinians in Gaza who aren't getting enough food, it's not because Israel is blocking it, it's because Hamas is stealing it. So much for that lie, but here's another. The ICC prosecutor accuses Israel of deliberately targeting civilians. What in God's green earth is he talking about? The IDF has dropped millions of flyers, sent millions of text messages, made hundreds of thousands of phone calls to get Palestinian civilians out of harm's way. But at the same time, Hamas does everything in its power to put Palestinian civilians in harm's way. They fire rockets from schools, from hospitals, from mosques. They even shoot their own people when they try to leave the war zone. A senior Hamas official, Fatri Hamad, boasted, listen to this, he boasted that Palestinian women and children excel at being human shields. His words, excel at being human shields. What monstrous evil. For Israel, every civilian death is a tragedy. For Hamas, it's a strategy. They actually want Palestinian civilians to die so that Israel will be smeared in the international media and be pressured to end the war before it's won. This would enable Hamas to survive another day and, as they vowed, to carry out October 7th again and again and again. Well, I want to assure you, no matter what pressure is brought to bear, I will never allow that to happen. The vast majority of Americans have not fallen for this Hamas propaganda. They continue to support Israel. And I want to say thank you, America, and thank you, senators and House members who continue to support us, continue to support Israel, continue to support the truth and see through the lies. But as for the minority that may have fallen for Hamas's con's job, I suggest you listen to Colonel John Spencer. John Spencer is head of urban warfare studies at West Point. He studied every major urban conflict. I was going to say in modern history. He corrected me, no, in history. Israel, he said, has implemented more precautions to prevent civilian harm than any military in history and beyond what international law requires. That's why, despite all the lies you've heard, the war in Gaza has one of the lowest ratios of combatants to non-combatants casualties in the history of urban warfare. And you want to know where it's lowest in Gaza? It's lowest in Rafah. In Rafah. Remember what so many people said? If Israel goes into Rafah, there'll be thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of civilians killed. Well, last week, I went into Rafah. I visited our troops as they finished fighting Hamas's remaining terrorist battalions. I asked the commander there, how many terrorists did you take out in Rafah? He gave me an exact number, 1,203. I asked him, how many civilians were killed? He said, Prime Minister, practically none, with the exception of a single incident where shrapnel from a bomb hit a Hamas weapons depot and unintentionally killed 24 people. The answer is practically none. You want to know why? Because Israel got the civilians out of harm's way, something people said we could never do, but we did it. These heroes here today, the heroic soldiers of Israel, should not be condemned for how they're conducting the war in Gaza. They should be commended for it. I want to thank all of you here today who forcefully opposed the false accusations of the ICC and stood up for the truth. These lies are not only libelous, they're downright dangerous. The ICC is trying to shackle Israel's hands and prevent us from defending ourselves. And if Israel's hands are tied, America is next. And I'll tell you what else is next. The ability of all democracies to fight terrorism will be imperiled. That's what's on the line. So let me assure you, the hands of the Jewish state will never be shackled. Israel will always defend itself. My friends, in the Middle East, Iran is virtually behind all the terrorism, all the turmoil, all the chaos, all the killing. And that should come as no surprise. When he founded the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini pledged We will export our revolution to the entire world. We will export the Islamic revolution to the entire world. Now ask yourself, which country ultimately stands in the way of Iran's maniacal plans to impose radical Islam on the world? And the answer is clear. It's America, the guardian of Western civilization and the world's greatest power. That's why Iran sees America as its greatest enemy. Last month, we heard a revealing comment, ostensibly about the war in Gaza, but about something else. It came from the foreign minister of Iran's proxy, Hezbollah, and he said this: "This is not a war with Israel. Israel," he said, "is merely a tool. The main war, the real war, is with America." Iran's regime has been fighting America from the moment it came to power. In 1979, it stormed the American embassy. It held scores of Americans hostage for 444 days. Since then, Iran's terrorist proxies have targeted America in the Middle East and beyond. In Beirut, they killed 241 US servicemen. In Africa, they bombed American embassies. In Iraq, they supplied explosives to maim and kill thousands of American soldiers. In America, they actually sent death squads. They sent death squads here to murder a former Secretary of State and a former National Security Advisor. And as we recently learned, they even brazenly threatened to assassinate President Trump. But Iran understands that to truly challenge America, it must first conquer the Middle East. And for this, it uses its many proxies, including the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Yet in the heart of the Middle East, standing in Iran's way, is one proud pro-American democracy, my country, the State of Israel. That's why the mobs in Tehran chant death to Israel before they chant death to America. For Iran, Israel is first, America is next. So when Israel fights Hamas, we're fighting Iran. When we fight Hezbollah, we're fighting Iran. When we fight the Houthis, we're fighting Iran. And when we fight Iran, we're fighting the most radical and murderous enemy of the United States of America. And one more thing. When Israel acts to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons that could destroy Israel and threaten every American city, every city that you come from, we're not only protecting ourselves, we're protecting you. My friends, if you remember one thing from the speech, remember this: our enemies are your enemies. Our fight is your fight, and our victory will be your victory. Ladies and gentlemen, that victory is in sight. Israel's defeat of Hamas will be a powerful blow to Iran's axis of terror. Another part of that axis, Hezbollah, attacked Israel on October 8th, a day after the Hamas attack. It has launched thousands of missiles and drones against us. 80,000 of our citizens in northern Israel evacuated their homes, becoming effectively refugees in their own land. We are committed to returning them home. We prefer to achieve this diplomatically. But let me be clear. Israel will do whatever it must do to restore security to our northern border and return our people safely to their homes. Last Friday, a third Iranian proxy, the Houthis, attacked Tel Aviv with a deadly drone. It exploded a few hundred feet from the American consulate, killing one person and injuring 9. On Saturday, I authorized a swift response to that attack. All our enemies should know this. Those who attack Israel will pay a very heavy price. And as we defend ourselves, on all fronts, I know that America has our back. And I thank you for it. All sides of the aisle, thank you. My friends, for decades, America has provided Israel with generous military assistance, and a grateful Israel has provided America with critical intelligence that saved many lives. We've jointly developed some of the most sophisticated weapons on earth. I choose my words carefully. We've jointly developed some of the most sophisticated weapons on earth that help protect both our countries. And we also help keep American boots, we help keep Americans' boots off the ground while protecting our shared interests in the Middle East. I deeply appreciate America's support, including in this current war. But this is an exceptional moment. Fast-tracking U.S. military aid can dramatically expedite an end to the war in Gaza and help prevent a broader war in the Middle East. In World War II, as Britain fought on the front lines of civilization, Winston Churchill appealed to Americans with these famous words: "Give us the tools and we'll finish the job." Today, as Israel fights on the front line of civilization, I too appeal to America. Give us the tools faster and we'll finish the job faster. My dear friends, the war in Gaza could end tomorrow if Hamas surrenders, disarms, and returns all the hostages. But if they don't, Israel will fight until we destroy Hamas's military capabilities, end its rule in Gaza, and bring all our hostages home. That's what total victory means, and we will settle for nothing less. The day after we defeat Hamas, a new Gaza can emerge. My vision for that day is of a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza. Israel does not seek to resettle Gaza, but for the foreseeable future, we must retain overriding security control there to prevent the resurgence of terror, to ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat to Israel. Gaza should have a civilian administration run by Palestinians who do not seek to destroy Israel. That's not too much to ask. It's a fundamental thing that we have a right to demand and to receive. A new generation of Palestinians must no longer be taught to hate Jews, but rather to live in peace with us. Those twin words, demilitarization and de-radicalization, those two concepts were applied to Germany and Japan after World War II, and that led to decades of peace, prosperity, and security. Following our victory, with the help of regional partners, the demilitarization and de-radicalization of Gaza can also lead to a future of security, prosperity, and peace. That's my vision for Gaza. Now here's my vision for the broader Middle East. It's also shaped in part by what we saw in the aftermath of World War II. After that war, America forged a security alliance in Europe to counter the growing Soviet threat. Likewise, America and Israel today can forge a security alliance in the Middle East to counter the growing Iranian threat. All countries that are at peace with Israel and all those countries who will make peace with Israel should be invited to join this alliance. We saw a glimpse of that potential alliance on April 14th. Led by the United States, more than half a dozen nations worked alongside Israel to help neutralize hundreds of missiles and drones launched by Iran against us. Thank you, President Biden, for bringing that coalition together. The new alliance I envision would be a natural extension of the groundbreaking Abraham Accords. Those accords saw peace forged between Israel and 4 Arab countries, and they were supported by Republicans and Democrats alike. We could call, I have a name for this new alliance. I think we should call it the Abraham Alliance. I want to thank President Trump for his leadership in brokering the historic Abraham Accords. Like Americans, Israelis were relieved that President Trump emerged safe and sound from that dastardly attack on him, dastardly attack on American democracy. There is no room for political violence in democracies. I also want to thank President Trump for all the things he did for Israel, from recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, to confronting Iran's aggression, to recognizing Jerusalem as our capital and moving the American embassy there. That's Jerusalem, our eternal capital, never to be divided again. My dear friends, Democrats and Republicans, despite these times of upheaval, I'm hopeful about the future. I'm hopeful about Israel because my people, the Jewish people, emerged from the depths of hell, from dispossession and genocide. And against all odds, we restored our sovereignty in our ancient homeland. We built a powerful and vibrant democracy, a democracy that pushes the boundaries of innovation for the betterment of all humanity. I'm hopeful about America because I'm hopeful about Americans. I know how much the people of this country have sacrificed to defend freedom. America will continue to be a force for light and good in a dark and dangerous world. For free peoples everywhere, America remains the beacon of liberty its extraordinary founders envisioned back in 1776. Working together, I'm confident that our two nations will vanquish the tyrants and terrorists who threaten us both. As Israel's Prime Minister, I promise you this: no matter how long it takes, no matter how difficult the road ahead, Israel will not relent, Israel will not bend. We will defend our land, we will defend our people, we will fight until we achieve victory. Victory over liberty, rather victory of liberty over tyranny, victory of life over death, victory of good over evil. That's our solemn commitment. And we will continue to work with the United States and our Arab partners to transform a troubled region from a backwater of repression, poverty, and war into a thriving oasis of dignity, prosperity, and peace. In this noble mission, as in many others, Israel will always remain America's indispensable ally. Through thick and thin, in good times and in bad, Israel will always be your loyal friend and your steadfast partner. On behalf of the people of Israel, I came here today to say, thank you, America. Thank you for your support and solidarity. Thank you for standing in Israel, with Israel, in our hour of need. Together we shall defend our common civilization. Together we shall secure a brilliant future for both our nations. May God bless Israel, may God bless America, and may God bless the great alliance between Israel and America forever.
We've been listening to the Israeli Prime Minister address the U.S. Congress there, an address that could only be described as strident throughout, a number of headlines. He began with the description of the current conflict as a clash between not just civilizations, but as he described it, barbarism and civilizations. He went on to say, referencing the protesters, many of which were outside the chamber, outside the U.S. Capitol today, accusing all of those protesters as supporting Hamas. He went on to say that they are Iran's useful idiots. That stands into contrast to the facts of which that many of those protesters, we've interviewed some of them on the air here, some of them are Jewish, some of them focusing their criticism on Israeli policy, not on Israel's right to exist as a state. He deflected a whole host of criticisms that have been leveled against Israel in the prosecution of its war in Gaza. He says that if Palestinians are not getting enough food, that is not Israel's responsibility or fault. He blames it purely on Hamas. We should note that aid groups have said that Israel has made it very hard to get not just food, but needed medical supplies into Gaza, and that right now we're seeing levels of starvation rising, as well as the return of diseases such as polio. Regarding civilian casualties, which number, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, in the tens of thousands, he claimed that when he has spoken to Israeli military officers, that those civilian casualties are greatly exaggerated. He even went so far as to say, he spoke to one commander who said there were practically none. I should note that U.S. military commanders themselves have expressed quite a different view of the level of civilian casualties in Israel since the start of the war, as has U.S. President Joe Biden at times, and Kamala Harris, now Vice President, of course, now the presumptive Democratic nominee for president. Two other bits of news from his speech. He used this language when describing Israel's intentions as regard the Iranian nuclear program. He said that when Israel acts to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. He said when, not if. Quite a public commitment, it seemed, to potential Israeli action, perhaps military action against Iran's nuclear program. And finally, regarding a post-war future in Gaza, he did say that Israel does not intend to reoccupy or resettle, but he said that Israel must retain what he described as overriding security control there for the foreseeable future. A strident speech, one that received a tremendous amount of applause from the Republican side of the chamber. There were a number of moments there during some of those lines when you could see on the Democratic side of the chamber that they were not standing and not applauding his comments. Our panel is with us now for their own thoughts. We're joined by Edward Jeredjian. He was a former U.S. ambassador to Israel. Alon Pinkas, longtime diplomat, as well as Colonel Cedric Leighton, of course, our military analyst. Ambassador, I wonder if I could begin with you. I certainly didn't hear from the Israeli Prime Minister an effort to reach out to both parties in this country, or even to others on the Palestinian side in his own country, or I should say, Israelis who oppose the prosecution of the war there. How would you describe his address?
Well, I think, Jim, this is vintage Netanyahu. There was, in my eyes, very little new in terms of strategy or tactics that he expressed. It was a very skillfully orchestrated political theater, actually, almost like a sports event. We win, you lose, in most of the applause lines. What disappoints me a great deal, again, is that Netanyahu framing the existential threat to Israel as only Iran. Iran is obviously a threat to Israel, to the region, we know that. But Iran is a nation state and will have to be dealt with as a nation state in conflict and in conflict resolution. But in my eyes, and in the eyes of many people, Israelis and Arabs and throughout the world, one can make the argument that the real existential threat to a democratic Jewish state called Israel is the Palestinian issue. Because in between, and Netanyahu mentioned between the Jordan River and the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, well, let me put it in this reference point. In between the Jordan River, and the Eastern Mediterranean, there are approximately 7.2 million Palestinian Arabs and approximately 7.2 million Israeli Jews. They share the land. They have to share the land. Neither one is going anywhere. And so what is Israel's future going to be? To continue to occupy the Palestinian territories ad infinitum? Because this has proven to be a disastrous policy with intermittent intifadas, instability, and wars, as we're seeing today in Gaza. And where was
Sorry, go ahead.
Where was Netanyahu's vision or reaching out for a negotiated peace agreement with the Palestinians? All I heard in the vision statement at the end of his remarks was that his vision is a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza and the other points he made. But that's not a strategy, that's a tactic. And so President Biden and even President Trump have advocated for a two-state solution, but we've never translated these words into action. So that's one of my great disappointments in this speech. And then conflating U.S. national security interests with Israel's national security interests almost totally is a bridge too far. So those are some of my original thoughts, Jim.
The phrase two-state solution did not come in what was nearly an hour address, and he used this language for nearly 4,000 years. It's always been our home, it will always be our home, which is often read as a message directly to those in Israel who do not see a two-state solution, and in fact see the annexation of the West Bank as a right, and certainly not an opening to a peace agreement to share that land as you described. Alon Pincus, as I was listening there, I heard at least just as many thank yous to Donald Trump as to the sitting president, U.S. President Joe Biden, who of course has been steadfast in his support of Israel, well, through 4 decades in public service, but particularly since October 7th, for which he's received an enormous amount of political criticism inside his own party and from voters in this country. And it's one of the reasons why you see 80 Democratic members of the House who were not present for that address, 9 senators not present, and the Vice President Kamala Harris not present. Did you hear, Alon Pincus, in that address a direct appeal, linking of arms in particular with the Republican Party?
Oh, obviously. What you've seen is not the Prime Minister of Israel. You've seen the Republican senator from Jerusalem speaking to his colleagues on the Republican side. And even though I agree on substance with everything Ed Jerigian said, and very few people know as much about this as Ed Jerigian does, I got to tell you, this is dissecting and analyzing the content of the speech, detached from the political intentions and the political motivations of Mr. Netanyahu, is doing it injustice. This was a series of 100 Chinese restaurant fortune cookies, just a bunch of incoherent cliches laid on the table. It was filled with inaccuracies, it was mendacious, it was manipulative, but back to your question, it catered to Republicans. And you are right when you said that the Republicans were cheering, because they invited him in order to sow discord in the Democratic Party, and he colluded with them in order to deliberately turn Israel into a wedge issue. This was not a political speech. This was not foreign policy being enunciated. This was just a bunch of a parade of cliches with absolutely no practical value. I'm sorry to say that.
There was even some red meat for Republicans there. He referenced the UNC, University of North Carolina fraternity brothers who were caught in social media confronting pro-Palestinian protesters there. That got a cheer. That got a cheer out of the Republican audience there. Cedric Leighton, it's good to have you on here because, resisting all evidence to the contrary, the Israeli Prime Minister claims really no Israeli responsibility whatsoever for the thousands of civilian casualties there. I know from speaking to U.S. military commanders that they have been critical of the conduct of the IDF inside Gaza, that they advised early on at the difficulty of preventing civilian casualties there. And we heard from the U.S. president public criticism of the conduct of the war. When Netanyahu claims and uses this language, practically none, to describe the number of civilian casualties in Gaza as a result of IDF action, is that a lie?
Well, Jim, yeah, you have to call it a lie because it is one of the most wrong statements that you could possibly make in a case like this. It is very clear, even though when you look at the statistics from Gaza, the Palestinian authorities, they do not differentiate between combatants and civilians. It is still very clear that thousands of women and children have been killed in these Israeli actions. And as a result of this, anytime you do something like that as a military force, you are definitely putting yourself at risk to be sanctioned by international legal organizations such as the International Criminal Courts or the International Court of Justice. And that becomes a very serious issue for, in this case, the IDF. And it is really essential, I think, Jim, that people understand that everything that is being talked about here there's a real problem with some of the things that have been said, because the facts on the ground are quite simply these, that the Israelis have killed civilians, and there have been numerous casualties on the civilian side, not just a few, not just 24, as he mentioned in his anecdotal reference to one of the military officers that he spoke to, but we're talking thousands here, and that is a serious, serious problem.
Before we go, Ambassador Deredjian, the Israeli Prime Minister suggested the possibility of a broader regional alliance against Iran. He suggested the title, the Abraham Alliance, building on the Abraham Accords negotiated under President Trump. Now, there has been some tension in those diplomatic relationships in the months and years since, particularly since October 7th, given the conduct of the war. Do you see a basis for the kind of alliance that he was suggesting there?
I think it's sheer empty rhetoric on the part of Netanyahu, because what Hamas did brutally on October 7th was to raise the price of normalization of Arab countries with Israel to the point where the top Saudi officials have said that normalization with Israel will now have to be predicated on, quote unquote, irreversible steps toward the creation and establishment of an independent Palestinian state. You cannot build a so-called Abraham coalition on sand. It has to be built on dealing with the critical land for peace issues between Israel and Palestine. And that's why this is empty rhetoric on Netanyahu.
Well, you speak from experience, also, Jim, certainly.
May I say, Jim, also, we all know this, but one of the reasons Netanyahu cannot utter these words in terms of possible agreements with the Palestinians for a state or anything of that nature is because of his coalition, his extremist coalition. If he utters that, he risks his coalition falling apart and his losing power. And we know that one of the reasons of this trip is for him to continue to stay in power despite all the challenges he's facing internally, legally, and politically.
Ambassador Deredjian, Alan Pincus, Cedric Layton, thanks so much for helping us digest the comments from the Israeli Prime Minister. Paula Newton, certainly a strident speech from the Israeli leader, and the reaction in the chamber there that shows some of the political divisions in this country over Israeli policy as well.
Yeah, Jim, I mean, such a consequential platform that the Republicans gave Netanyahu there. I have to bring up the comments of Jerry Nadler, who we have to say is a representative, who was sitting there and in fact did say that this, even though he would sit there, he said this is the next step in a long line of manipulative bad faith efforts by the Republicans to politicize the U.S.-Israel relationship. I want to go now to the video that you are seeing, and that is protesters burning American flags. As we said, very tense moments on the streets of Washington, D.C., as pro-Palestinian protesters at times have clashed with pro-Israeli protesters, many of them voicing their concerns that Netanyahu would be given this kind of a platform. Kylie Atwood, I believe you're standing by for us as we continue to parse this speech. Again, as Jim said, strident, but again, he was given the platform to really air a lot of grievances that we have been hearing from him for months. Specifically, though, when we talk about a proposed ceasefire deal that is on the table right now, the fate of which hangs in the balance, what did you hear from that speech? And obviously, negotiators will listen to that speech as well.
Yeah, well, listen, what we heard from the speech was really a rallying call from the prime minister aimed at both an American audience and an Israeli audience. The Israeli audience trying to make the case that he is the prime minister who has the best connection to the American public. He is standing there on Capitol Hill being listened to by so many members of Congress. And then to the American audience, really reminding them of how horrific October 7th actually was, going through that in quite some detail and making the case that going after Hamas is a greater effort at play that benefits the United States. He said, our victory will be your victory. He talked about going after Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, saying that that is ultimately targeting Iran, which is an enemy of the United States. So really trying to rally people behind Israel, as there have been, questions, criticism of how Israel has been conducting this war, particularly recently with the mounting number of Palestinian deaths. The other thing that the prime minister did here was speak to all factions of the political system here in the United States. He thanked, of course, President Biden for his continued support of Israel, saying that he is a proud Zionist. But he also, at the end of the speech, made a point to thank former President Trump for all that President Trump did for him when he was in office. Notably, the prime minister is going to be meeting with both of those leaders over the course of the next few days here while he is in the United States. So he is a very deft political actor, and he took this stage to make sure that he could speak to both of those. And we should note that his praise for Biden wasn't exactly effusive. He thanked him, but then he also went on in this speech notably to request that U.S. military assistance to Israel is expedited at this time. He said, give us the tools faster and we'll finish the job. Of course, quoting Winston Churchill in World War II, making that plea to the United States at the time for weapons. So that was a notable remark that he made. We'll have to watch and see how that plays out, how that is received by U.S. officials who have repeatedly said that their military support to Israel has gone on mostly unimpeded, minus that hold on those 2,000-pound bombs that remains in place.
Yeah, it is a very good point that although he did thank the Biden administration, it seemed to come with those caveats and conditions that more is yet to be done. Kylie Atwood for us, thank you so much. We want to go now to Jeremy Diamond, who's been following all of this from Tel Aviv. And obviously, I'm curious about your reaction, the reaction in Israel, to what was really an extraordinary platform for this prime minister that has seen his troubles in domestic politics there. How do you believe this will be viewed, especially with those all-important coalitions that make up the Israeli government right now?
Yeah, that will indeed be the question. It'll be interesting to see how the Israeli political system kind of digests this speech over the coming days. I mean, there was a little bit of something for everyone who was watching this speech. You know, he made several nods to the families of hostages, to former hostage Noor Argamani, who was in the crowd at that moment. But ultimately, what he really focused on was this notion, once again, of achieving victory over Hamas. And so while he did talk about the ceasefire negotiations, he did talk about bringing the hostages home, I think it was clear that the overarching tone of the speech to members of Congress, but also clearly to an Israeli political audience as well, was to say to the United States, give us the tools we need and we will finish the job. And finishing the job, in his view, as he said repeatedly, was we will fight until we achieve victory. Those do not sound like the words of an Israeli prime minister who is on the cusp of signing a ceasefire agreement with Hamas. And we should note that U.S. and Israeli officials have told us in recent days that that a ceasefire deal is indeed within reach, and it very much now seems to depend on the position of the Israeli Prime Minister himself on whether or not he wants a deal. And I don't know that this speech gave us any more confidence that the Israeli Prime Minister does indeed want a deal here. Now, he did try and strike a largely bipartisan tone as he was addressing these lawmakers in Congress. He thanked President Biden for his solid support for Israel. He also thanked former President Trump for signing achieving the Abraham Accords breakthrough, and talked about propelling that forward, which is a major goal of the Biden White House. But I also think that one of the key goals of the Israeli Prime Minister here was trying to effectively portray the Israeli military campaign in a positive light, and to try and push back on what we have all watched over the course of the last 9 months, which is just an enormous number of civilians who have been killed during this military campaign. And the Israeli Prime Minister at several points tried to push back on those notions, and some of his claims were simply false or not believable. I mean, he talked about the ICC making these allegations that Israel is starving the people of Gaza. And he said that claim was laughable. He talked about big numbers of aid that's actually getting in, but there is just clear evidence that Israel has not allowed enough humanitarian aid into Gaza. It's been evidenced by the very fact that they have at points allowed more aid and then less aid in very significant numbers, indicating that they can indeed have some control over the faucet of aid that gets in. And it's also clear that the Israeli military, if you listen to any humanitarian organization, they simply have not done enough to provide safe passage for those aid trucks to get in. Now, he also talked about Rafah, claiming that he was told by an Israeli commander that practically no civilians have been killed in Rafah, which is simply not true. I can think of several strikes in Rafah off the top of my head. And he also made this kind of broader claim about the Israeli military having the lowest civilian casualty ratio in modern warfare, basing it on a West Point expert, John Spencer. I can tell you I've talked to a number of military experts on civilian casualties in warfare, and they all say that Israel simply does not do enough to protect civilians in warfare, and that it doesn't even come close to the efforts that the United States has made in various contexts, even those conflicts in which the United States has killed a significant number of civilians. Even though kind of worst case examples of U.S. military action, they don't come close to the number of civilians that we're seeing killed per strike, for example, as the Israeli military carries out this campaign in Gaza.
Yeah, and going so much further in this speech, Jeremy, actually ridiculing the pro-Palestinian protesters and call them, of course, Iran's useful idiots. Jeremy, before I let you go, I just want to ask you as well, though, about what he said about the northern border there. It was, in fact, a comment here regarding the fact that he would return tens of thousands to their homes in northern Israel. Jeremy, I'm going to let you go for now. We're going to get back to you right now. I want to toss it back to our Jim Sciutto, who has a guest for us on Capitol Hill.
Thanks so much, Paula. I'm joined now by Congressman Don Bacon of Nebraska, Republican. He was in the room for the Israeli Prime Minister's address. He joins us now. So tell us your reaction.
I thought it was a great speech. You know, the Prime Minister, I think he's concise, but he's forceful in his presentation, and he made it clear he's going to finish the job against Hamas in Gaza, and he's going to reestablish a Palestinian government of some type. It's got to be, can't be an adversary to Israel. But he also made it clear that Iran is the long-term threat, and they're the puppet master of Gaza, or I should say Hamas, Hezbollah, as well as the Houthis in Yemen. But he shows a moral clarity the way he speaks, and I think it's forceful.
Let me ask you, he did not mention the phrase two-state solution once, and you know this debate has been long-term, and there have been questions from inside Israel whether he has any interest whatsoever in what has been a long-standing bipartisan U.S. policy among Republican and Democratic presidents. Is that a mistake? Is he throwing all of his weight behind purely force as opposed to the possibility of a negotiated peace with the Palestinians?
My take, and I've met with him multiple times, been in Israel, he would support a second state, but they're not ready yet. They want to destroy Israel. I mean, they always say they want.
Who's they though? Hamas.
Hamas,
yeah.
and I also say the Palestinian Authority really doesn't want an Israeli state. They see it as one state where they're in charge. That's how I take their response. I think once the Palestinians accept that they can have the West Bank, perhaps Gaza, and have to figure out how to connect the two. Then they can have peace, but there's really not an acceptance of Israel as a Jewish state. Until we get there, there's not going to be a two-state solution. But the Palestinians are going to have to come to understanding that if there's a two-state solution, one of them is a Jewish state.
Do you, of course, 80 Democratic members of the House did not attend today, 9 Democratic senators did not attend, and the vice president, who normally would be presiding behind a speaker such as this, was not. She had a previous engagement, but you can imagine there might be a political element to that as well. There was a lot in this speech that seemed directed specifically to the Republican audience there. And there were moments when your side of the aisle was standing and applauding and the Democratic side deliberately was not. Where does Israel's relationship stand with America writ large as opposed to the Republican Party in America?
It's interesting that the dynamic I find in the House, we're very unified on Israel. We're divided on Ukraine, which I support.
Right.
But on the other side of the aisle, the Democrats are fairly unified on Ukraine and divided on Israel, and it's and that's why we handled the funding bills. We did them separately because we get both over the finish line. So I got to give credit to the speaker. Good chess match there, and he played well. I want to make sure it's an American support for Israel, not just Republican support. I've traveled there. I went there at 15. I've been there as a colonel, putting in missile defense, and I want America to stand by our ally Israel. And if it's just a Republican Party, that's not good for our country. It's not good for Israel. Because in the end, Israel will be at risk on that. And I wish the same thing for Ukraine. I would like to see more unanimity, because America has a strong voice in the world, with strongest voice for freedom. And if we're divided on Israel, that threatens Israel. And I thought he gave a good speech that wasn't divisive in that regard. You're right. There was more support on the Republican side.
No question. There was, particularly as relates to civilian casualties in Gaza since the start of Israeli military operations there post-October 7th. He addressed that. He used the phrase practically none when describing civilian casualties there, and he said that Israeli forces should be commended for the conduct of the war. As you know, President Biden, who's been a steadfast supporter of Israel for decades, including since October 7th, he has criticized that there needs to be more attention to civilian casualties. And I've heard that, I will say, from Democrats and Republicans, and I've heard it from U.S. military commanders as well. Do you think that was a fair statement for him to deny any responsibility for civilian casualties in Gaza as a result of Israeli military action?
I would say generally I agree with him. But obviously there's been a lot of civilian casualties. But whose fault really is that? Hamas is hiding in the midst of the civilians, and they're the ones putting civilians at risk. I do believe Israel's trying to do their best to discriminate between
Even
Hamas
with the weapons they're using, because some of the criticism from President Biden has been using really big weapons, and you know with your military background that commanders have choices as to what they use for particular. You could use a 2,000 bomb, or you could use something smaller, and oftentimes it's been the 2,000-pound bomb.
Well, the other side of that is if you do smaller weapons, you may not get your target, and then Israeli soldiers are being killed. So typically, if they're the other side of this, more soldiers will get killed for Israel, and that's a hard decision if you're the Israeli commander and you're going after terrorists who are hiding the civilian population. But it's a conundrum. It's very hard. I mean, I served in Iraq and Afghanistan. When terrorists are hiding amongst the civilian population, it's hard. But I think I believe is trying to do the very best they can. But in the end, they're going to kill Hamas. They murdered and raped 1,200 people. This is war as hell, as General Sherman said in the Civil War. And they're going to kill Hamas. And the best thing for them to do is surrender and give up. I don't think they're going to do that. But I think Israel is driven to finish this war, and it's going to end when they think Hamas is totally destroyed in Gaza.
That certainly seemed to be the message from the Israeli leader there. Congressman Don Bates,
it's a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks so much for taking the time. Paula, you hear the view from inside the chamber there. Well, actually, we're going to take a short break and then go back to Paula Newton as we continue to cover the Israeli Prime Minister's address to the U.S. Congress.
The biggest trends, the latest business ventures, and the boldest investments pushing the continent forward.
We're all required to build a better Africa.
Who will see profits? What opportunities?
The Abraham Alliance. Joining me now, Avi Meir, longtime expert on Israeli political affairs. Avi, good to have you with us today. I wonder, as you listen to the Prime Minister's speech, he was strident in his defense of Israel, but he made a number of statements which I think you can at a minimum say were not entirely accurate, but you might even say were straight up false. He said that there were practically none when he was describing civilian casualties as a result of military action there. He denied any Israeli responsibility for food getting in and out of Gaza, and he characterized all protesters in this country, which, as you know, many of the anti-Israel protesters, some of them are Jewish, right? He called all of them supporters of Hamas and useful idiots for Iran. Did he go too far in this speech?
Well, Jim, I think the Prime Minister hit pretty much all the notes I would have expected him to. It was, as you said, a very robust and strident speech that I think was focused at both an American audience and an Israeli one. I should note that all the notes I would...
For Iran. Did he go too far in this speech?
Well, Jim, I think the Prime Minister hit pretty much all the notes I would have expected him to. It was, as you said, a very robust and strident speech that I think was focused at both an American audience and an Israeli one. I should note that he was referring specifically to the military operation in Rafah when he referred to that low number of casualties. He said, they said we couldn't do it. We couldn't evacuate these large numbers of civilians. Israel did, in fact, do that, which resulted in a comparatively low number of civilian casualties there. He did characterize the protesters on U.S. college campuses and elsewhere as useful idiots. That is not necessarily a description that I would disagree with. But when he talks about the Iranian hand in steering those protests on and offline, he's referring to an assessment made by the Director of National Intelligence, who said that Iran is directly involved in funding and directing those protests, perhaps not all of them, but a certain number of them. So look, I think he certainly engaged in rhetorical license, but I wouldn't say that his points as a whole were entirely off base.
Well, the trouble is, though, he's denying the possibility of any criticism of his leadership or the conduct of the war, which we know is not isolated to the protesters. We were just showing some live pictures there outside the Capitol building today or on college campuses. We know that includes members of...
You're watching MSNBC.
Benjamin Netanyahu and feel like he's done Israel a terrible disservice in especially his latter years of premiership. I will say, I was just, as you mentioned, I was just over in Israel. I was having a conversation with some leading public intellectuals who aligned with Netanyahu, who even suggest that the Benjamin Netanyahu of the 1990s or early 2000s would not be in this position, would not have the dilemma that he has at hand. And I think that's an interesting point to dwell on for a minute for thinkers. But I will say this: I think what you mentioned earlier, Katie, is something that's really important. I think in analyzing the public sentiment and the political pitfalls of this relationship, which is people of Joe Biden's generation and perhaps a couple generations after that grew up with an Israel that was not sure to exist, that was a fledgling country that did not have the military might and the economy that it has now. Now Israel is one of the most important countries in the Middle East, certainly one of the most important countries in the world with a vibrant economy. A lot of Western companies have set up shop in Israel. It's not seen as that underdog that it has been for the last 50 or 60 years. And I think that's what's at least partially at issue. And I hear that on Capitol Hill all the time, especially with younger members of Congress who say that Israel should be judged as every other country is judged. And that's why I think so. You see some of that public support slip away. Now, you alluded to this, but how will Kamala Harris handle Israel and the relationship between the United States and Israel if she were to be elected? I don't know the answer to that. And I think in my conversations with Israeli officials, I mean, I think there's even question about how Donald Trump would handle the ballooning conflict in Gaza. He's not somebody who likes to have his fingerprints on a situation that's not getting good publicity. And I think Israelis recognize that based on my conversations with people, both in Netanyahu's inner circle and in the Israeli government and society writ large.
Yeah, and the question is, can Benjamin Netanyahu, with his rightward tact, continue to maintain a strong relationship with the United States, continue to maintain this alliance, which it desperately needs. Jake, I want to bring in Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Senior Fellow and former Arab-Israeli negotiator with the State Department, Aaron David Miller. Because, Aaron, you know this issue better than any of us do, frankly. You've been on the front lines trying to negotiate between the Palestinians and the Israelis, trying to find peace, which has been so elusive. Can you talk to us about what might come next for the American-Israeli relationship, say, if it were a President Kamala Harris?
Right. But first, I have to say, Kitty, thanks for having me. Don't put me down in the shocked and surprised category, or even the disappointed category, with respect to what Benjamin Netanyahu had to say. This was predictable, because the visit itself has nothing to do with substance. It has to do with our politics and his. And he walked into a situation which is fraught. He'll have a relationship with Joe Biden for the next 6 months because he needs the United States. He cannot afford, and I suspect in a minute I'll tell you why I think this may actually be running in a positive direction. He's going to try to get off on a reasonably good basis with a potentially putative American president, Kamala Harris. And perhaps the most important piece of his visit is the pilgrimage, the sort of Israeli Hajj, if you will, to Mar-a-Lago. Because it's quite clear, by one count, 100 of the 212 House Democrats were in attendance. 27 of the 51 senators were in attendance. What you've witnessed in this visit is not what it's going to achieve. It's what it reflects. And what it reflects is the frame, I won't say the death of, because there will be a change of leadership in Israel, I suspect for the better. But what it reflects is a degree of stress and deterioration of the key adhesive, which has kept this relationship functional and quite extraordinary. And that is bipartisanship. You have a Republican Party that is now the Israel Can Do No Wrong Party. You have a Democratic Party that is deeply divided, not just between progressives who want to impose significant costs and consequences on the government of this government of Israel for its behavior, but mainstream Democrats, Senators Coons and Murphy and Van Hollen, who at various times in the last several months have basically called for conditioning U.S. military assistance to Israel. What is stunning to me is in the Democratic Party, there is now a full-fledged debate as to what constitutes being pro-Israel. And that is an extraordinary transformation, frankly, and I think in part a necessary one, but I think Mr. Netanyahu has contributed mightily, as have our own politicized, polarized politics to the deterioration of that bipartisanship. Whether it will endure under a President Harris, it's a very good question. I suspect that the inner Kamala would want to be much tougher, much harsher, much more sensitive and empathetic to the exponential rise of Palestinian deaths in Gaza as a consequence of Israel's efforts to prosecute a war started by Hamas terror surge, and I think more willing to understand that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a conflict between good and evil. It is in the main a conflict between, it's Goethe's definition of a tragedy, competing justices, where Israelis and Palestinians have mutual needs and requirements if this conflict is ever going to be resolved, and if the U.S. is ever going to be an effective broker in this conflict. That is a point of departure. Both have mutual needs and requirements that have to be met.
That's such a good way to put it. We haven't spoken in a while. I wonder if you think that this conflict is any closer to coming to a close. I know the negotiations for a ceasefire and hostages have been intensifying recently. There's some anger, as Andrea reported, that Benjamin Netanyahu has put things on hold to come to the United States to meet with Congress, to meet with former President Trump, President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris. What's your sense of how things, or where things currently stand?
Yeah, I think I've mentioned to you before that from my experience, and this is not an ordinary Middle East negotiation, since the principal Palestinian decision maker is ensconced 30, 40 meters below ground in a tunnel, probably below Khan Yunis or maybe even in Egypt, Yahya Sinwar. But these negotiations typically have two speeds, slow and slow. But I would say that there is a possibility, in large part because pressures that Hamas are under, and as a consequence of Israeli Defense Forces pressure for a deal, in an effort to deal not with Gaza, but with the looming problem of what exists on the Israeli-Lebanese border, that it is possible to imagine. Knesset goes into recess July 28th, and it resumes shortly after the Jewish holidays, roughly 2 weeks before our election. Mr. Netanyahu's game is to survive in that recess. But in that recess, it's extremely difficult to bring down an Israeli government. And the influence of his two extremist ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, would be neutralized during that period. I suspect, and again, I've been wrong about many things, that the chance of a deal in mid-August is really quite real. I do not believe that it's a deal that would go through 3 phases, but I think there's a reasonable chance that you could get through phase 1, a limited hostage exchange for Palestinian prisoners and a 6-week ceasefire. If you got that, it might well provide a point of departure on which the administration could actually build to bring about a cessation of the war. Whether or not that plays out the way I hope it plays out, I think it's a real possibility.
Aaron David Miller, really good to have you. Thank you, as always, for joining us on big days like this. Joining us now, New York Congressman and ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler. Congressman, thank you for joining us. I know you were inside that room listening to the Prime Minister's speech. What did you think of it?
I thought it was fundamentally dishonest. He says he wants a peace, but his political interest is to keep the war going as long as possible because he knows that as soon as the war is over, he'll have to face a commission of inquiry as to why he was telling Qatar to arm Hamas before the election and why he ignored warnings from the military about the attack on October 7th, which they had warnings about a few hours earlier, and why, for that matter, it took 12 hours for tanks to come 60 miles from the West Bank to the kibbutzim on the Gaza border. And he knows he'll have to answer these questions. And his interest is to keep the war going as long as possible. And that's what he's doing. And when he talks about the hostages, I don't believe he has any interest in releasing the hostages because that would hasten the end of the war. And that's why you see hostage negotiations, and he keeps putting new conditions. He keeps putting new objections to the hostage deal. And that's why you see hundreds of thousands of people in Israel protesting against